Jorge, could you give us a brief history of the internal conflict in Colombia and the relationship with structural inequalities in the country? Perhaps. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for allowing me to be here. I'm very pleased, Julian, that you've been able, together with your colleagues, to call together this conversation. I'm also very happy to see Charlie and other friends who are with us this evening. I'm going to try in just a short time to tell you a story called Colombia. And it's a story that is a positive one because Colombia is a great country. Colombia is almost 1.2 million square kilometers. You find every climate in the country. It has a coast on both the Pacific and the Atlantic, which is to say the Caribbean. It has mountains. It has perpetual or year-round snow. It has beaches. It has some of the best lands. It is a powerful country, a compelling country, and it's worthwhile experiencing it and getting to know it. That country is facing some difficulties that have to do with the armed conflict. But even before the armed conflict, it has to do with historical, social, economic, and political realities. The best lands of Colombia are in the hands of 3,000 landowners. There was never any land reform in Colombia. And there are inequalities that make Colombia the second most unequal country after Brazil in the region, which makes it very different from other countries in the hemisphere. There is inequality, there is concentration land ownership, and what could also be a great agricultural potential to produce food isn't working because the land is devoted mostly to extensive cattle raising. And at any rate, the lands are not producing anything. That's a pre-modern, semi-feudal model of land tenure that we've not been able to resolve over many, many years. And in addition to that inequity or inequality in land tenure, there are other factors that come into play that make Colombia a country of great poverty. Half of the population, and the total population is 50 million, half the population is living in poverty today, ranging from extreme poverty to multidimensional poverty. Those circumstances also make it possible to give continuity to a view of the country that is informed by other phenomena that I want to share with you in telling you this story. First of all, those landowners not only hold land, but also land is a foundation for political power. Those landowners are represented in the Congress, in the National Congress. They're represented in large numbers. That makes it possible to explain why there's never been a democratic agrarian reform, why there's never been an integral or comprehensive rural reform. And with those, alongside those landlords are other groups, or the landowners are other groups, the bankers, the few companies, the few industrial conglomerates, uh, form coalitions with that political class in order to exercise power from Congress, but also from the office of the president. Unlike other countries, Colombia has not have any government other than the governments or the administrations of the traditional political parties, which have always governed the country. Unlike other countries, in Colombia, there are circumstances of violence which have been drawn out over many, many years. In these and the armed conflict is situated within these general circumstances of violence. But the Congress is in the hands primarily of the landowners and the owners of the country, and the presidency represents the same interests over long periods of time. And there's another important factor. Those landowners may enter into alliances with drug traffickers who at first used Colombia to produce drugs, the raw material for which came from other countries. Then they learned that in Colombia they could grow coca leaf as well. And today, together with Mexican cartels, they have a significant share in the most significant drug production in the Western Hemisphere, illegal drug production in the Western Hemisphere. What happened over so many years for Colombia to suffer so much violence? Peasants or campesinos rose up in arms and formed guerrilla movements that basically called for distributing the land democratically and having opportunity for political participation. And those guerrilla forces grew, and those guerrilla forces put the Colombian state in check. And the response has always been a military response, not a social response. Those guerrilla movements provoked one of the longest internal armed conflicts that have ever been seen in the world, because that began in the 1960s. For 50 years, a single guerrilla movement fought the state, but other guerrilla movements also followed suit and took up arms themselves. And then one asks oneself, what was the use of so much violence and of so many people killed? There is a figure to talk about figures, and it's really not such a good idea to talk about figures. It's not good to talk about figures when one is talking about human beings, but there is an official figure of the number of people who have been killed in Colombia throughout this whole long stage of violence. 262,000 people over the last 50 years. And of those 262,000, 215,000 were civilians, people who were not participating and not involved in the war. And 46,000 approximately were combatants on one side or the other that participated in the hostilities. A very prolonged war geared basically at destroying the social movements and the rural farmer movements that attacked the civilian population. And it ended up in extreme degradation in terms of the number of persons exiled, disappeared, displaced, as well as persons who fell victims to other forms of violence from the state, such as torture and cruel and inhuman treatment, which was came to be a general phenomenon throughout the national territory. Those forms of violence established in the state, but also provoked by these irregular armed groups, led the country into a profound human rights crisis, as well as a humanitarian crisis that has not yet ended. The idea of making peace has been present ever since the war began, but it has not been possible. During this period of violence and armed confrontation, the government of the United States has played a major role, because the government of the United States has strengthened military intervention. At the beginning, in the first years of the 21st century, they adopted a Plan Colombia, the United States did, and strengthened the armed forces, providing almost $10 billion. The idea was to fight drug trafficking and the guerrilla forces in Colombia. The pretext was drug trafficking, but the real objective was to eliminate the guerrilla forces. And 20 years later, what is the result? The violence continues. We continue producing cocaine. They keep assassinating people. The armed conflict has not ended. And so the question is, what has been the use of so much investment by the US government in a country that has not been able to overcome either the causes of violence, nor has it overcome the humanitarian and human rights crisis. It occurred to somebody that it was necessary to sign a peace agreement. Several groups had tried this over the years. In Colombia, there was a group called the M19. This was an urban guerrilla movement, and it was the first one to sign a peace agreement. And then another guerrilla movement, the FARC, Revolutionary Forces of Colombia, who after many, many years did sign a peace agreement on November 24th, 2016. This was a final agreement to bring an end to the internal armed conflict and to build a stable and lasting peace. That's the long title of the peace agreement signed for 5 years ago. And we thought that it was the time when Colombia would truly take a step towards peace. But that's not what happened, because of a problem that we're still not able to figure out the exact dimensions of. The peace talks between the FARC and the Santos administration took place like in a glass ball or a bell or in an island. It was the people at the top of the armed forces of the state and of the insurgency who negotiated a peace agreement. But there wasn't a real participation of society as a whole. And that led to a fracture or a rupture between the community, society, and those armed elites, because the guerrilla forces did not represent the whole people, and the government did not enjoy full legitimacy to negotiate because of pressure brought to bear by those sectors who never wanted peace. Nonetheless, that peace agreement was signed and entered into. It's so important to sign a peace agreement to bring an end to the war, and we celebrated this. And we thought that it was the beginning of a new peace in the political history of Colombia. And therein come the other problems, because this number of dead over such a long period of time have been followed by a stage in which violence declined. The number of dead, the number of people killed declined. And it seemed that the peace was taking, but then the other factions of violence that have always been part of Colombia's history continue to be very much present. Colombia's had many wars, and each war has been followed by a peace agreement or a peace treaty, and then another cycle of war. And this time has been no different. That peace agreement was put to a public referendum, a referendum which we all thought we were going to win with a yes, to say yes to the peace agreement. Yet we lost. The no vote won. And therein came a major fracture, because while there was a minimal difference in the votes cast, the no vote won, and this placed in check the legitimacy of the peace accords. And they had to go back to Congress and find another way where the international community participated significantly to save the peace agreement, which is now part of Colombian law and has constitutional rank. What happened with those who signed the peace agreement? There were 13,000 members of the guerrilla forces who decided to lay down their weapons. And it was agreed that an integral rural reform or comprehensive rural reform would be undertaken, and that a democratic political opening would ensue, and that the entire peace agreement would be revolving around the victims in a model of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition, around a transitional justice system that would make it possible for those who made the war to engage in politics. And that peace agreement said, we're going to fight drug trafficking in a different way, giving the campesinos an opportunity to grow food crops rather than coca leaf, and also to give opportunities for drug addicts to be treated with a public health approach rather than a criminal law enforcement type approach. And certain guarantees were offered to the former combatants. It wasn't a bad agreement. But the very forces that opposed the peace agreement brought about an environment that has made it possible for 293 of those who laid down their weapons have been assassinated. They created the conditions for these 293 persons to be assassinated over these 5 years. And it's not just the former combatants. Alongside with them, the approximately over 1,300 social leaders have been assassinated in a country that sees how so many social leaders and political leaders get assassinated because presidential candidates have been assassinated, members of Congress have been assassinated, and people who engage in social protest have been assassinated. Why are we so violent? What is it that moves us to be so violent in Colombia? I hope that those who study, say, sociology here and study political science and psychology could help us to understand what is happening, why we have to come and tell you the story of such tragedies of a powerful country that has such a potential to get ahead. And what has happened more recently is continuation of those forms of violence. Some members of the guerrilla forces decided to sign the peace agreement and then go back to war. Very few, but some. They're known as the dissident fronts or the disidencias. Others never entered a peace agreement. One known as the National Liberation Army, another guerrilla movement that has been fighting for over 50 years, has not been militarily defeated, and they continue fighting. And there are other armed groups as well. Now, the Mexican drug traffickers learned first they would use Colombian territory for drug trafficking, and then they learned that they could grow, process, produce, and export cocaine from Colombian territory. That is why there's something known as the Clan del Golfo, the Gulf Clan. And there are other expressions of that form of drug trafficking operating in Colombia that are not political, because these are people who kill because it doesn't matter to them, because they have no sentiment, they have no rootedness, there's no consideration whatsoever there. That's why we have reached certain circumstances of violence where we see the emergence of new forms of violence who have kept a large part of Colombian territory in check today. We tried to make peace, and we are witnessing a reproduction and proliferation of new forms of violence. And one could say, looking at the questionnaire, the questions you've got for me, that in this effort to achieve peace, which is never ending, comes the tie-in between the agreement and the possibilities that are opening up with elections that are to be held next year in Colombia. The history of a country that has not overcome war, like a cork in a whirlpool, a war that is not won militarily, yet it's a peace that we've not yet been able to build politically speaking. That's why this invitation and this introduction is to say, thank you for being concerned, to think about, to analyze what goes on in a country such as Colombia. And I'd also like if we could see it from your perspective as we pursue this dialogue this evening. You spoke about this a bit, but perhaps you could say more details about the role that the U.S. government had in the internal conflict in Colombia. Disaster, a disaster. What the government of the United States has done, sometimes under the logic of fighting drug trafficking, but always in counterinsurgency logic, has been to further sink the country into these circumstances. Charlie was there talking with the government 20 years ago, with the different administrations, trying to explain that attacking drug trafficking like they did in Colombia, well, at first there were 2 drug cartels and large coca crops. Plan Colombia had a mercurial effect, or it had the effect of mercury, like when you split a particle of mercury, it proliferates all over, breaks into so many pieces. Today we have God knows how many cartels. There's a fragmentation of drug cartels and a spread of crops. So at the end of the day, the drugs become a pretext for maintaining domination over countries such as Colombia. And behind this domination are other interests which have to do with the country's economic model, uh, export of coal and oil. And with this, Colombia has been able to keep part of the Colombian economy afloat. We have also achieved positive things. The government has imposed certain conditions on the assistance, referring to human rights, which has worked sometimes well, sometimes it hasn't worked so well, but at least they have put forward the possibility of taking advantage of this relationship with a view to shoring up democracy and human rights. I would hope that we could see a change in that policy. It doesn't seem to be the case. While we no longer have the same military assistance, we do have a high degree of presence of the United States in the Colombian armed conflict, in the conflict historically, and in the violence today. So we've talked a little bit about the peace process, but could you tell us a little bit about the position of the current administration vis-a-vis the peace agreement, and just talk a little bit about the presidency of Ivan Duque? The peace agreement was signed by President Santos. And after the Santos presidency, the opposition, the opponent, the lead opponent to the peace accords won. He was designated by former President Alvaro Uribe, that is, say, the current President Ivan Duque, and they came into government with the idea of tearing up the peace agreement. They said they don't believe in it, the peace agreement. They said people voted against the peace agreement, why should we support it? But as I already told you, the peace agreement was incorporated into Colombian law. It was officially made part of the Colombian constitution, and it has been also endorsed by the UN Security Council. So undoing the peace agreement is not easy. So what they tried is to change the terminology, to change the name. No longer do they talk about peace agreement, but rather peace with legality, as a way to insinuate that Santos' peace agreement was somehow illegal, whereas Duque's peace is a legal peace. And while the Duque administration has strengthened some actions for peace, today we can say that the peace accord has only been implemented 30%. Only 30% of it has been implemented. That means that most of the reforms, most of the decisions entailed in the agreement have not been carried out. It also means that the guarantees for those who lay down their weapons to be able to engage in politics do not exist insofar as many of these people have been exterminated. Of course, there are representatives of the FARC guerrillas in Congress. And yes, of course, there is a new political party emerged from the old FARC called Comunes. But despite these small advances, despite the disarming of the guerrilla force, the peace agreement is not being implemented. The Duque administration has its last day August 7th of next year, and the result of implementation of the peace accords has been very precarious for Colombia, because a very conservative political force, very right-wing political force, has taken it upon itself to keep the peace agreement from consolidating, and this is the result of 3.5 years of administration, and no doubt up until next year we'll have an administration that has put all the obstacles possible in the way of the implementation of the peace accords. What do you think the role of the United States should be vis-a-vis implementation of the peace accords in Colombia, but also how likely do you think it is that the United States would play that role? Now it's a democratic administration, right? Supposedly. One would hope that there'd be a real commitment to peace, because the United States, uh, why is it the United States has played such a nefarious role in so many wars around the world? You who protest and who express your emotions, but also your reasons, could help us think through a response to that question. One would expect or hope of a democratic administration in the United States an in-depth and genuine commitment to human rights in Colombia. That could be an important starting point. One would expect that or hope that the government of the United States would change the mentality informed by providing military assistance and yield instead to a policy aimed at addressing the armed conflict by, for example, helping to facilitate negotiations with the ELN, the National Liberation Army. There have been some members of the guerrilla force, ELN, in Cuba for the last 5 years, and they're known as the peace delegation. It's not been possible for them to negotiate because the government decided to shut its door to peace negotiations with them. And in large measure, it was because of pressure brought to bear by the previous administration of the United States. But this current administration hasn't changed that vision. But in particular, one would expect that the government of the United States would understand the logic of prohibitionism, and that drug prohibitionism generates in large measure violence in Colombia, because drug trafficking is not only an incentive behind the conflict, but it also takes over the institutional spaces and it corrupts. Drug traffickers corrupt the institutional spaces. The drug traffickers have taken part of political power in Colombia, and that doesn't help us build peace. And so why do we continue to talk about drug illegality problem? Well, because look at the United States. In Colombia, marijuana is prohibited even for medicinal purposes, not in the United States. But there, they impose a logic of war on us. In Colombia, there are 141,000 people in the prisons. 73% are on drug charges, and they're not drug traffickers. The small growers and the urban people in the cities who are consumers or drug users. They are pursued by the authorities, but not the drug traffickers. And so when is the United States going to think about making a change to that anti-drug policy? What might the role of the United States be? I think we're moving towards that possibility, but it still seems far off to me. In the meantime, the war on drugs that is led by the US government is not only a failed war, but it's also a business that multiplies and reproduces drug trafficking around the world. If we take from the drug traffickers the drug business, if we were to take from the drug traffickers the control that they have over the coca growing campesinos and the drug distributors at the street level there and here, then no doubt Colombia could embark upon a different age. But this is an effort that we need to make both civil society there and here. And I would hope that political parties and social movements will help us rethink this failed drug war that we have suffered from. Now, I have a few questions, a set of questions, which are, who is Gustavo Petro? What is the Pacto Histórico, Historic Pact, and what are its proposals for, or his proposals for the elections of next year? In March of 2022, we're going to have congressional elections. The Congress has never been renewed. That is to say that politics in Colombia continue to evolve around the same models of corruption. But in the Congress, there's now a possibility that would appear to give continuity to the intent of change that began 4 years ago. 4 years ago, Gustavo Petro, who was a former guerrilla member of the M19 guerrilla movement and who has been a brilliant senator. He's also served as mayor of Bogota. He ran for president 4 years ago, and for the first time, he was able to make it to the second round, and he got 8 million votes. He was very close to winning the presidential elections, but he didn't. In May of next year, there are presidential elections. Unlike the situation 4 years ago, today, Gustavo Petro is in the lead in all of the polls for president. Does that mean he's going to win? That we don't know. Because in the first round, if no one gets 50% of the votes in the first round, then according to the rules in Colombia, there's a second round. And what happens to us could be what happened in Ecuador. The left candidate, who had the largest number of votes, lost to the right-wing candidate because a coalition formed. And you begin to see such a coalition beginning to form in Colombia as well, which is a right-wing bloc to stand in the way of any political change in Colombia. That is reality that we have to face. But let's think positively. Let's say Gustavo Petro is going to win. And are they going to let him govern the country? Are they going to even let him become inaugurated? I'll say something even harsher. Are they going to let him go on living to complete the presidential campaign? Because in Colombia, we have some very nefarious antecedents of major political figures being assassinated. And almost always these are figures from the left or from pro-democratic sectors. Gustavo Petro is calling the country to come together around something that sounds quite interesting. Changing the country is going to require an effort that goes beyond the left. That means a pact or an alliance. A pact is an agreement among different persons, among diverse interests. If there's something that Colombian society has, it is diversity. And we have learned to recognize that diversity. Fortunately, we're not all men. Before it was thought that that was so. And fortunately, we don't all have the same skin color, the same ethnic origins, or the same skills, or the same sexual orientation. That diversity of the population requires an agreement, which also has to do with interests, not only of those who are most excluded and living in poverty, and the workers, and of the peasant farmers or campesinos, but also the producers, the small and medium owners, and the business sector. Gustavo Petro is engaging in an experiment which may or may not work, or could not work, which is a historical pact to change Colombia around based on three essential points. The first is to generate a productive economy. Could it be that Colombia doesn't produce anything? What does Colombia produce? It produces oil. A good part of national income depends on oil, and it's running out. The reserves of Colombian oil are not going to last another 20 years, and it produces coal. It's got the largest open pit coal mine in the world. But the coal is passing into history because the countries that have historically consumed coal have decided, because of the climate change impact, have decided to use less coal as a source of energy. And Colombia produces cocaine. So these are extractive economies and illegal economies that are upholding the economy of the country. Why doesn't Colombia produce food? If we have enough land to produce it, why does Colombia import 12,000 tons of food a year when we could produce and export food? Why don't we process the foods? Where's our national industry? The pandemic has taught us that we have to produce with our own capabilities. The Historic Pact, or Pacto Histórico, proposes a productive country that would strengthen small and medium industry. They call Petro Castro Chavista, reference to Castro in Cuba and Chavez in Venezuela, saying that he's going to expropriate everything. But what about the people who have thousands of hectares and don't produce? They need to have a tax imposed on them. And if they don't pay the tax, then they should sell the land and the state will buy the land. These are models that are being worked on so that Colombia can be a productive country and a competitive country in the region and in the world. The second point of the three has to do with adapting Colombian territory to climate change and mitigate its effects. The political leaders who understand climate change from a progressive standpoint are political leaders who have the obligation, they see that they have an obligation to bring about public policies in their countries to deal with this issue. Thus far, it's only been rhetoric. Doing it means changing the use of energy. It means changing the mentality of consumers, the policy of a country that doesn't produce greenhouse gas, but that can adapt and provide an example of a transition to clean energies. And that's part of the thinking behind the Pacto Histórico, the Historical Pact. And the other element has to do with education, because without education and respect for basic social rights, Colombia can't get ahead, nor can it improve its possibilities for really achieving peace. In Colombia, students don't go to the university. The university is not free in Colombia. What they now call zero tuition programs have not got off the ground yet. In Colombia, there are some regions where of every 10 high school graduates, only 2 go to the university. 8 just end up adrift. Engaging in public education, which is knowledge and wisdom, guaranteeing health, which in Colombia has been privatized, underpinning democratic reforms in the countryside and credit in politics are part of a whole set of policies that Gustavo Petro has put forward, saying, let us put forward these proposals, let's have a minimal agreement, a common agenda, and let's move the country forward so as to transition from a country at war to a country at peace. It's a very ambitious program. The question is, does Colombia wish to change? And if it does wish to change, are they going to let Gustavo Petro govern as president of the republic? We don't know yet. But that is Gustavo Petro, and that is the Historic Pact, which is also accompanied by other center and right-wing political proposals. And we don't yet know, or forces, central and right-wing forces, because it seems that what they call center in Colombia is more to the right than to the left. And they don't want to see Petro as a centrist or as a democratic-minded politician. There is a woman whose name, she's a representative to the House in Florida, Maria Elvira Salazar, who said that Petro is a terrorist, a thief, and a socialist. Petro was very concerned that they called him terrorist or a thief. And there is a debate about the meddling of the Republican Party in Colombian elections, just as the pro-Uribe forces that are in the current government of Colombia came to Florida and campaigned for Trump. So in May, there's going to be a first round, and if no candidate wins more than 50%, there will be a second round in June, and the new president of Colombia will take office on August 7th. We don't know if it'll be Gustavo Petro or if it'll be somebody who emerges from a central or right-wing, alliance to keep Petro from being president, and whether we will see the current situation that we have in Colombia prolonged and drawn out or not, or whether we can make a change. What would the priorities be of a possible administration by the Pacto Histórico in relations with the United States? And what do you think, how do you think the United States would react if the Pacto Histórico emerges triumphant in the elections? That's a good question. The government of the United States, will it respect the victory of a candidate with the characteristics of Gustavo Petro? I would like to ask that question here in the corridors of power in the United States. If we apply representative democracy, if democracy exists, if this democratic system in the hemisphere works, then a victory by Gustavo Petro should be respected. I understand that Gustavo Petro will maintain relations of respect, self-determination, sovereignty, and cooperation with the government of the United States. It's my understanding that Gustavo Petro will generate a model of relations respecting the real fact that the main trading partner of Colombia is called the United States, and that is a reality that should be maintained, but with some different characteristics. Climate change will be at the center of the public agenda. Human rights are going to be at the center of the public agenda. Agricultural production, and even amending the free trade agreements, which are an obstacle to domestic production, will be part of the discussion with the United States. I imagine that a Petro administration, if he is elected president, could maintain the best relations with the government of the United States, indeed, vis-a-vis the other governments of the region, because there's a problem called Venezuela that must have a democratic solution and not just a solution based on force, which an attempt was made to impose that at one point in time. And I think that new political leadership in Latin America, in this region, particularly in Colombia, which could be accompanied by another victory, which could be Lula, the former president of Brazil, might win the Brazilian elections, and other possible changes could allow for a different correlation of forces in the relationship between Latin America and the United States. It will all depend on what happens in Colombia, but it will also depend on what happens in Brazil. Also, there's interest in learning about, well, there were many protests and there was the whole movement known as the Paro Nacional, or national strike in Colombia. And the question is, what's the role of students and youth in the protests in the national strike, Paro Nacional, and what's the relationship between that social movement and the elections coming up next year? In Colombia, there was a national strike. It was unprecedented, given the characteristics of participation, because of how long it lasted and because of the confrontation that it produced in the country. And it all began because it occurred to the president to impose taxes on food when people were going hungry in the midst of the pandemic. And it all began when the government decided to reform the healthcare system in order to further its privatization, and not for health to be a right, but rather to prolong healthcare as a business and as a commodity. But in addition to that, other factors were of discontent were accumulating. The students were not able to go to the university, and the students who went to the university realized that the budget wasn't enough for the public universities to operate. And the students, since 2019, had been engaged in street protests in defense of public education. All of this came together, and on April 28th of this year, what happened was a social upheaval. But that upheaval, which was called by the trade unions as a national strike, it really went beyond the trade union leadership. The unions thought that it was going to be a 3-day strike. And they were frightened when they saw that people were going out to the street, taking to the street in multitudes. And something quite interesting happened. On May 1st, in the middle of the protests, the trade union said the workers should not take to the streets. They convened a virtual protest by internet. Well, the people ignored them. Who didn't ignore them? Well, particularly the young people. Why? Because the young people were really in the front lines, in the vanguard of the social movement. And that expression of student rebellion, or and this way of channeling popular discontent led people to support the youth in the poor neighborhoods, in the streets, and the youth became empowered, and they became a key point of reference for social protest in Colombia. And this has happened in other parts of the world as well. But what happened in Colombia, almost like what happened in Chile, but with even more hard-hitting, made clear the political power of young people when they decide to go out and engage in social protest. Obviously, there was brutal repression. We're now talking at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, saying that the number of persons who were disappeared in the context of the strike might be something like 140 people. Imagine you go out to the protest and 10, 12, 13 of your fellows are disappeared. And then some people were found, tortured, and assassinated in rivers, which speaks very poorly of so-called Colombian democracy. But people have been detained, people have been stigmatized. The front line became an option of protecting oneself and protecting protesters. And they want to say that these are subversives, treating them just as they treated guerrilla movements in the past. And therefore, the participation of students is an act of one needs to politically analyze the capacity for action of those sections of the population, women as well, and indigenous people as well. The same diversity that I mentioned before was brought into evidence or made quite clear in the strike, the paro. But the question is, after this strike, which lasted more than 100 days, with that social and political power of the grassroots movements, is that going to play out in the elections or be reflected in the elections? Well, there we have a problem. There could be there's a disconnect there. We already said the trade unions didn't understand the protest. Was it understood by the political parties? Does the left understand the social movements that have been emerging in the social upheaval? We'd really have to analyze the capacity of the political parties to understand these new forms of leadership. In Colombia, there's also an intergenerational struggle. I've experienced it, I perceived it, because the young people appropriated the situation and the older people did not understand, and that rupture has not yet been resolved. So it's a very valid question, very good question. What's going to happen in the elections? The young people who went out to protest, are they going to take to the polls and vote? We don't know. But if they do vote, they would change the country, because there are more or less 3 million new young people who have just turned 18 and who are going to be able to vote for the first time. Traditionally in Colombia, the young people don't vote, but let's hope that they do, to see if we can have this social protest translate into political power in the elections that we held in March and in May. Very well. Thank you very much. That's the end of the questions that I prepared. So perhaps now we can open it up to any questions of anyone who's here. If there's any questions in English, perhaps Viviana, who's the executive director of the Center for Justice and International Law, maybe she'll translate it, because no doubt she can do a better job than I can.
Can you kind of shout if you can, and that way I'll be able to simultaneously interpret for the people who don't know Spanish.
You could stand, you'll project. My father's from Palmira, Colombia, and they tell me what's going on. I don't know much about what's going on there, but they talk to me about the guerrilla movements. It's not always positive. So I'd like to know your opinion about that. Do you only see the guerrilla movements as something positive, or the violence that they cause, or is that a lie? I don't really know. Should we take more questions? No doubt there'll be more, but let's begin with this one. I began by saying that I was going to tell you a story called Colombia. And Colombia is a powerful country, a rich country, a country with great potential. There's so many cultural festivals. In Colombia, there are 1,170 municipalities, and there are 1,140 local festivals or carnivals. People are very happy, despite everything I've told you. If you go to Cali or Barranquilla or Buenaventura, and you will find the joy of the people. And that is why I started off speaking in those terms. Of course, there are bad things that we don't like. Violence, guerrilla movements, drug trafficking. So what we need to do is to think about how to change the country, because what we have, what has happened over so many years, hasn't worked. But I like that call to attention. It seems to me that there was a writer, a Uruguayan writer, who said that we need to leave pessimism for better times. We cannot succumb to adversity and pessimism. So if they ask you, what did I come to this university for today? Well, to convey a message of peace, optimism, and happiness that Colombia will change, and that we are going to stop being the country of violence and drug trafficking of the hemisphere, that we're going to become the productive and peaceful country that we've always dreamed of, and with democracy and human rights. But based on the starting point is reality that pains us and that we really need to transform. Something I found interesting about Colombia is the fact that the landowners often have strong relationships with the army and the local police. And from what I've read, I think that was very relevant during this social movement. Could you talk about that relationship and the implications it has for Colombia? Well, we said, I was saying that the land represents economic power and political power. We have calculated that there's not more than 2,700 landowners who have more than 5,000 hectares. And that's very few compared to the very large population of the country. Those landowners don't own the land in order to make it productive. And a good part of that land is money laundering from drug trafficking. So how do they sustain that power? With corruption and violence. And the violence operates through paramilitary groups, and a good part of the landowners and large ranchers contracted paramilitary groups who for many years killed many people. The state itself says that 95,000 people were killed over 20 years, just to give you an idea of the scale of the whole thing. So the landowners have economic power, they corrupt the state, they co-opt the state, and they generate violence. And that is reality that we've not been able to put in the past. And they also have representation in Congress, and they also exercise political power locally. The idea is to change land tenure, democratize land, credit, and knowledge. And so we need to make a break with that semi-feudal model. If you review the agrarian histories of Latin America, you'll realize that Colombia is really still in the 19th century. It got stuck in a semi-feudal situation, not only because of land tenure, but also because of the use made of the land and everything that implies in terms of political expression. Of course, there are also agricultural producers who don't think like the majority of the elite. They want the peasants and the farmers to be able to produce with the land, and that's one of the big issues in the election debate now. You failed to answer half the question. He asked if there was evidence of the use of police groups in the protest. Oh, I didn't hear that part. Yes. Not only police groups, well, the paramilitary groups began to take on an urban form. And this has now become quite common in Colombia, and it's not been fought. Indeed, many civilians who shot at the protesters are still free, whereas the people who set out to protest are being put in prison, put in the jails. I'd like to know if there's any option, if you consider that any candidate other than Petro would be viable, would be able to do something similar, and with whom a larger percentage of Colombians would be in agreement or would agree to vote for. Well, if I answer by citing the surveys, the polls, we could say that an option known as center, that's being called the center, is emerging or taking shape. And it is led by persons such as Sergio Fajardo, Alejandro Gaviria, Humberto de la Calle is also there, and sectors of the Liberal Party who want to present themselves as being above the polarization, that it should be neither Uribe on the right or Petro on the left. That possibility already came up in the last elections, and because of that, when Petro went on to the second round, Sergio Fajardo went to engage in whale watching and did not support Petro, and I think that that caused the country a lot of harm. Now, that alternative could emerge. What I would like personally is for that sector, to reach agreement with Petro, and that in the March elections, they choose a single candidate. And if that candidate is not Petro, Petro should support that candidate. And it's very likely that if such an agreement is achieved, then we'll win the elections on the first round. That is being discussed today at this very moment in Bogota among some of the sectors. We don't know if it'll be achieved, but if we go into the elections divided, it's quite possible that the right wing will win the elections once again in Colombia. I'd like to know, how did drug trafficking come about in Colombia? First, it was marijuana. The best marijuana in the world was produced by Colombia in the 1970s. I never tried it, but that's what I heard. And that the fact of marijuana trafficking being illegal generated other models, and it changed that landowner model. It led many landowners to get into the marijuana business. Now, what fed that business? Well, the very fact that it was illegal. If marijuana is illegal, then the price is going to be higher and going to attract those sectors who with violence can take over production. And then they saw that it was better to process coca leaf rather than growing marijuana. So they brought coca plants from Peru and from Bolivia, and they set up large laboratories, and Colombia became a powerful processor of and exporter of cocaine. And after that, they realized that you didn't have to go and look for coca leaf outside of Colombia, but rather we could produce it inside of Colombia. We began to produce coca leaf and process coca leaf and export cocaine. And then Plan Colombia came to end the coca crops and the cocaine trade, and instead there was a proliferation of the crops and of the drug cartels. And then the Mexicans came, the Mexican cartels, with the idea that they could take advantage of the laboratories in Colombia for processing the drugs, and the Mexicans realized it would be best for they themselves to grow it and to process it, and they took the Colombian traffickers out of the picture, and so they're at war because of that. So an illegal business with logics of the illegal dynamics provokes the situation of widespread violence around a business that benefits many people in Colombia, especially those in the elites in power. So that's my short story, my short history of drug trafficking in Colombia. I think we're placing a lot of emphasis or giving too much credit to the role that a president can play in Colombia to change how the country's run. Just like Iván Duque has not been able to tear up the peace agreement, I think that Petro or anyone else from the left can't really change much. My question is, what legislative strategies can we bring to bear on the Constitution to prevent individual personal interests of big capital, whether it's drug trafficking or just people with a lot of money, buying politicians in the country who then stand in the way of the change we need? Because as we are, even if Petro reaches the presidency, I don't see much changing. That's my question. I don't know if, as a person who's close to the Pacto Histórico, what insights or perspectives you might have. That's a very good question. Colombia is a presidentialist country, but that presidentialism has never worked for the alternative sectors. Moreover, an alternative president is going to face ferocious opposition from those who really hold power. If there's not a change in the Congress, the president isn't going to be able to do much in terms of reform. So that's a big unknown. That is why insisting on a change in the Congress is like the first task. And the Congress has always been in the hands of the traditional parties and the landowners and the powerful sectors. For this reason, the Historic Pact is not just one person. The thing is, we've largely personalized it with Petro and Uribe. But I fully agree with you that Petro is not a messiah, he's not the savior. Moreover, if there's not large-scale participation of the different political and social sectors, Petro could be a great failure as president. Or he'd have to spend a good part of his presidency defending himself, as we did when he was mayor, even though he was able to defend himself and we were able to be a government. But it's going to be much more difficult. It's a valid observation. What we need are not any caudillo, no messiahs, nor do we need to feed the traditional presidentialism of Colombia anymore. But we need to construct, we need to build, and the Historic Pact is collective. It's not just one person, and there are two different political branches of government, or rather two sources of government, the politics and the democracy is exercised in the streets, which is very important for building a democratic society. My parents are among the many Colombians who came to the United States in search of better opportunities. And there are many Colombians in the United States who are interested in politics in both countries. And Colombians who live in the United States will be able to vote next year at the consulates. So my question for you is, what suggestions do you have when it comes to talking to Colombians who are very much on the left in the United States, but they refuse to support Petro in Colombia because they think he's too radical and they've not pardoned him for having belonged to the guerrilla forces in the past? I don't know. They should listen to what he has to say, one person said. I think that a political dialogue is needed between Colombians in Colombia and Colombians abroad. I think there is a Colombian political subject that is quite dispersed, and we on the left have not been able to understand them. The Christians in politics and the right wing, they do a better job of reaching out to Colombians living abroad. But we're only now beginning to, first of all, recognize that community in exile and that community of Colombian migrants. It's quite large. It's a ranges between 7 and 10% of the total population of Colombia in the United States, as we know. Well, in Miami and in general in Florida, there's a significant movement of Colombians who support a left-wing alternative, but a lot of fear has been generated here, the fear of Petro because he was a guerrilla fighter, because he's saying that he is Castro Chavista, saying that he's terrorist. All of that is going to do a lot of harm. And it seems to me that the effort that should be made from Colombia is not only to come and bring a message, but also to listen to Colombians. What do Colombians who are living in the United States think? I don't know of any survey that would enable us to know what are the preferences and what are the expectations of the Colombians who live in the United States. I just don't know. I'm not familiar with that. And I think that now, quite soon, Gustavo Petro is going to visit the United States, or at least some places. At any rate, I think he'll come to Washington. I hope you can bring him right here and ask him any questions that you wish. But I agree. There's a need to review that relationship with Colombians living outside Colombia, not only from Colombia in this direction, but also the Colombians living outside should have a greater impact on what goes on in Colombia. I think that Colombia, I think it is important to engage with Colombians living abroad. Oh, yeah. Oh, but what about putting it into Spanish? I was going to put it in Spanish too. Thank you for being here. Gracias por estar aquí. As you said, left-wing guerrilla groups have been making peace over the years. Los grupos de izquierda han estado haciendo la paz a lo largo de los años, pero los paramilitares siguen armados y actúan con impunidad. ¿Qué avance ha habido para hacerles llegar a la mesa de la paz y cuál ha sido la barrera principal para que depongan las armas? The paramilitaries? Yes. Sí. There was a negotiation with the paramilitary groups, and it was betrayed by President Uribe when he extradited some of them to the United States for just one reason, because in the United States, they could not tell the truth about the crimes that they committed. And in addition, here they were being tried for drug trafficking, not for murder or crimes against, or massacres or crimes against humanity. Several of the members of the paramilitary who were extradited by Uribe have gone back to Colombia, and they are rearming in different parts of Colombia. And in tandem with that rearmament, new phenomena of paramilitary groups have emerged in both rural and urban areas. In rural areas, very much associated with the group known as Clan del Golfo and other types of groups tied to drug trafficking. They've always been tied to drug trafficking. Now, I can't say that there is a resurgence of the paramilitary model as we knew it 20 years ago, but I do believe that there's a reaccommodation of that paramilitary idea that continues to be relevant in several parts of Colombia. The government has not truly fought the paramilitary groups, and that could be another demand that should be put to the US government, that military assistance to Colombia should be conditioned on fighting the paramilitary groups. That hasn't happened in Colombia for many years, and it's not happening right now. Can you say something more about relations between Colombia and Venezuela and the large number of migrants? There are about 2 million Venezuelans in Colombian territory today. One of the few good things that Duque has done is that he gave regular migratory status to the Venezuelans. Independent of the political reasons for doing so, I think that was a valid move because it was necessary to extend our hands to reach out to the Venezuelans, just as Venezuela reached out its hand to Colombians many years ago when many Colombians went to Venezuela in search of a better life. There should be more normalized relations between Colombia and Venezuela. Whoever becomes president should ensure normal relations. The border between Colombia and Venezuela is a very vibrant, long border. Shutting down that border and putting forward the idea that Maduro has to fall, as Duque proposed, was a serious mistake. And the community in the border areas are asking or calling for the border to be opened. So first, migration needs to be made regular. Second, there should be priority attention given to Venezuelan migrants. Third, the border should be opened up for the free circulation of persons. And fourth, a mechanism should be established, a Colombian-Venezuelan mechanism should be formed in order to address the situation of Venezuelan migrants there and here. But that requires a relationship. There's been a degradation of migration, and there's been xenophobia in Colombia that has been very harmful for the Venezuelans in Colombia. Están en la cárcel por cargos por drogas y son usuarios o pequeños cultivadores. ¿Qué tipo de jerarquía mantiene unidos los carteles, pero imposible en la cárcel para los pequeños cultivadores? I'm sorry. Could you repeat the question a little louder also as you're saying it? Usted mencionó la guerra a la droga y cómo ha sido un fracaso en Estados Unidos. Y también ha mencionado que en Colombia que el 75% de las personas en la cárcel que están en la cárcel es por el uso de drogas o pequeños cultivadores. Quiero saber cuáles son las jerarquías de poder, demografía, de clase, qué es lo que hace tal que los grandes carteles pueden seguir fabricando las drogas que se producen y se cultivan, pero los usuarios están en la cárcel. A large part of the reproduction of the drug phenomenon has to do with production, which are the small growers, and the weight of the law is brought to bear on them, and the users who, instead of receiving a public health approach attention, they instead are dealt with by the criminal justice system for consuming drugs. Most persons, well, in addition to most of the people being in the prison for drugs, about 40% are women. Women heads of household who were seeking a solution to their economic problems and turned to very small scale drug dealing or became involved in the chain somehow at a very low level. I think the situation is not that different in the United States. So many of those who have been put in prison for drugs are Afro descendants. And this shows a great vulnerability of populations which are at the end of the day victims of the economic cycle of the drug business. In order to free people from the prisons, and this has been put forward as an option in the context of decriminalization of drug use, well, that could, perhaps these people can be let out. I have several questions. Why are the big drug traffickers not in prison? Why are those who have laundered millions of dollars in Colombia not in prison? And I ask, Where are the US drug traffickers who receive the drugs and distribute them? How many of them are in the jails of the United States? And I ask, why are there so many drug traffickers who have laundered millions of dollars? Why are so many of them Colombians living in the United States today? Why is there a trend on the part of the DEA to negotiate with these drug traffickers based on them delivering funds to the US Treasury to legalize those fortunes or to capture those resources in the United States? There is a profound inequality in the way in which the drug question is approached. And at the end of the day, those who are hardest hit are the most vulnerable sectors of society. And we're going to have to think about this in both countries, because therein lies a large part of the drug trafficking problem. I have one last question. Drug trafficking is a business that produces a lot of money. I don't know if you already explained this, but where does this money go? Most of the drug trafficking resources end up in tax havens in the United States. It reproduces certain forms of capital accumulation inside Colombia. Also, drug trafficking resources finance paramilitary groups. They've also financed guerrilla groups who have used drug trafficking to finance themselves. And I think that a large part of the Colombian economy also depends on the drug trade. I've been working in a port in the Pacific Coast region called Buenaventura. 60% of all of the imports and exports of Colombia flow through Buenaventura. Yet it's a town, a city that is in terrible poverty. And in Buenaventura, you see many people with cash in their pockets, even though 78% of the population is unemployed and depends on informal economic activity. Where do people live from? I want to raise this example because if there were no drug trafficking in Colombia, and I'm not trying to advocate for or apologize for drug trafficking in Colombia, but I repeat, if there were no drug trafficking in Colombia, in this exclusionary and unequal economic model we have, the situation would be much more serious. In the pandemic, it was seen in the Caribbean coast how, despite the economic recession brought about by the pandemic, there was no halt to construction. There was no halt to construction because it's drug trafficking resources that guaranteed the continuity of construction in cities such as Barranquilla and Santa Marta. So, of course, there's a myth about everything that drug trafficking implies, but many people live off of drug trafficking, and many bankers and many tax havens and many governments that also use drug trafficking to support themselves. What are we going to do about that? Well, it's not just us Colombians who need to come up with an answer. We need to come up with an international answer to the problem of drug trafficking. Fortunately, now in Egypt, the leaders of the world are meeting to talk about, are going to be meeting and to talk about drug trafficking and corruption. So we'll see what emerges from this new United Nations summit against drugs and crime. I wanted to ask whether you could recommend any books about politics in Colombia in general, or something like that, for us to be able to learn more. You can buy Jorge's books. He's put out 2 books, I think. Well, I didn't come to push my books because, well, we've run out. wrote a book about the leader of the FARC guerrillas, Timochenko. But I think that the books by Gonzalo Sanchez can help you understand what's happening in Colombia. Gonzalo Sanchez is a professor at the Universidad Nacional. Also, to understand the drug trafficking economy and cooperation of the states, there's a book by Luis Jorge Garay. And to understand drug trafficking, there's also a book by Ricardo Vargas. But we could come up with a list of 10 or 12 books that help one understand the conflict, violence, and drugs in Colombia, in addition to the reports on human rights, which I think also help one understand what's going on in the country. But to understand the conflict, I recommend the books by Gonzalo Sanchez. Oh, última pregunta, no sé. Thank you very much, Jorge, for this talk. I'm from Colombia and I've learned a great deal. But there is a matter that has been discussed in terms of social equality, but it's been discussed less specifically in terms of class, social class, and how social class is a social category that defines a great many things in Colombia, like the pandemic, the social situation of the strike, and also the change in social class relations that could either favor or hinder the outcome of the elections. For example, the possibility of Petro winning or some other candidate who is not from the Uribe group winning. The pandemic resulted in a serious concentration of power in the banks. The bank's profits are huge. In the middle of the crisis, a lot of the issuance of resources or the resources allocated by the government ended up in the banks, and the subsidies that the government approved went to benefit the large companies. The logic is if we stop the large companies from failing, then employment will be maintained. But at the end of the day, it's taking resources out of the national treasury to further shore up the most powerful. Whereas 600,000 micro enterprises and small and medium enterprises went bankrupt. And that is the tragedy we're experiencing today. There's been an increase in poverty. What the National Statistics Department says is that right now we have 26 million poor people in the country. And in cities such as Barranquilla or the Caribbean coast in general, families are eating 2 times a day. So there begins to be a real deterioration in the quality of life. And the campesinos are practically bankrupt. The situation in the countryside is very difficult, except for coffee. There's been a coffee bonanza or coffee boom. And so there has been significant recovery of that part of the economy. But in general, the pandemic and the economic model, because it's not the pandemic alone, have expanded the gap of social inequality. And unfortunately, the figures for next year are really going to be terrible for Colombia. And that's what has to be changed. Now, you should bear in mind that in Colombia, there are 3 economic groups that came together to keep Petro from becoming president. The Antioquia-based business group, the Ardila Lule business group, and the Santo Domingo-led group. These 3 groups, which basically run 70% of banks and industry in the country, don't want a different alternative. And that's a very serious matter. I don't know if you realize that they just undertook a commercial operation between Saudi Arabia and some business persons in Colombia to obtain Nutresa, which is the largest food production company. And some are saying that this is an operation or transaction such that if Petro wins, they're going to create a problem of undersupply in the country, undersupply of food. But we could say this is just a conspiracy theory, and that's not going to happen. But we are facing very real power in the form of the multinationals and the big business persons who participate in politics in order to stand in the way of real change. I'll ask you one more question of my own. Could you say a little bit about indigenous movements in Colombia and how indigenous communities have been impacted by the armed conflict and their role in the country's current situation? In 10 days, the indigenous groups of the Cauca are going to go back to Cali, and they are like the leadership of indigenous resistance in Colombia is concentrated in the department of Cauca. And the greatest expression of that rebelliousness is to go to the city of Cali, because for them it's calling attention to the failure to carry out the peace agreements. And in Cali, there are racist sectors that have said that they're not going to let them come into the city this time. So we are facing a very serious problem of confrontation. The indigenous folks have groups have the Minga, which is like a collective work or collective protest, but they want to depict the Minga as something subversive. There are 114 indigenous peoples in Colombia. Many of them are in danger of extinction. I don't know if you see that each month, on average, 2 or 3 indigenous leaders from the Cauca are killed. So there's an ongoing extermination of the indigenous peoples. We're talking about the young people and the students in the protest. The indigenous peoples have secured a leading role in the social movement with great organizational capacity and with great capacity to become involved in politics. They will be participating in the elections. And it's very important to understand what that presence of indigenous peoples in the social movement means, but also their presence in the political transformation of Colombia. Very well, with that, thank you so much, Jorge. Thank you, Charlie.